I have had a couple of conversations with people in the break, and a couple of questions I want to go over again with you. Bart spoke about what they do in the Netherlands from a policy perspective and how they get these decisions made, and in part because it's because of a several hundred-year history of fighting the ocean, fighting the water, and in part it's because they've thought about how to fund this ahead of time so they don't have to keep on having the same arguments and discussions. But what it comes down to, Kate had mentioned, was the fact that you have to get people, and the people who they elect, to take the conversation seriously and to make decisions based on having taken it seriously. And in some cases, when it comes to water, when it comes to climate, weather, we're not at that stage. So what should we be thinking about doing to take this message out to the public, to make it appealing to the public, so that they can bring pressure to bear on either their elected officials or their companies or their utilities, or whoever it is that they need to bring pressure to bear to advance this cause? What examples, have any of you seen good examples of what could work, or have really good ideas about what could work in terms of mobilizing the public around this cause that only seems to affect you if you live in a place that floods or you live in a coastal area? How do you get this into the public consciousness? Not all at once.
Okay, I'll start with that. So this is something that we think about a lot as a water resources agency, the civil works part of the Corps of Engineers. And people who have suffered through an event like this, they think about it, but not for too long. Once they get past the recovery, you found this, that they're not willing to make those investments. But really, for us, it's a matter of trying to show those benefits, making a business case. You know, in the U.S., it's the public, it's the private sector that really kind of drive the changes, and so it's making that business case that this is going to help the U.S. economy. And even people in a state like Wyoming care about what happens on the coastline because our economy is intimately connected. You know, if they can't get goods and services to port, they're not going to make a sale. So that's the kind of thing that I think we should think about, is the connections between all of us globally, not just in the States.
I think it's a very difficult question, actually, because I think, as Kate said, I think when you get a flood event, I remember I lived in the United States for a few years, a long time ago, and FEMA always talked about the 6-week window of opportunity when people would think differently. And after that, they said then the shutters come down and they want to go back to where they were. So it's actually, one aspect is really hitting after major events, like the recent hurricane, because people will think differently. And also, I think that means a lot of preparedness, so that whenever an event comes, you've got a plan up your back sleeve that says, well, we could do things differently. So that, you can't do that work in that short time. So a lot of preparation has to be done beforehand. So that's one way. I think, interestingly, I think there's also a cultural difference. In the UK, I think people are much less resistant to, almost expect government to look after them with flooding. So it comes down to what people expect from government, and certainly in the UK, probably in the Netherlands too. I think we have different expectations of our government, so it also varies.
A lot of the world has different. The U.S. is sort of built a different way, and we don't, but we do need them when we need them, and it creates conflict in our minds as to what government is supposed to do. I had a good discussion with somebody who asked a question that I tried to ask earlier, but maybe I didn't state it as well as he did. Once the temperature has risen to the point that we think is the worst case scenario and all the ice is melted, what's our boundary condition? How bad could this possibly get?
Well, I think the answer is 70 meters. But that's melting all of Antarctica,
all of it, yeah.
Which is about, and I think maybe it's actually 77 meters, actually. I think it's 70 meters in Antarctica.
Yeah, you didn't really need to get that precise after like 20 or 30.
But I can't help myself.
Wow, okay. But most scientists are not planning for that because we're not expecting everything to melt.
The times, I mean, what we're worried about really is there's about a meter in glaciers, in fact probably less than a meter in small glaciers. Greenland's about 7 meters. The West Antarctic ice is about 3 meters. That's the bit that's vulnerable, so we could see 10 meters. But the timescales of that are hundreds of years. So we're talking timescales that we would not normally think about. As I say, I think 2 meters in the next 100 years is kind of a good upper estimate, although we can always be proved wrong. I mean,
right.
you know.
But Bart, you also thought that the 35 to 100 centimeters might be conservative, so you also, that you live in that world, that 1 to 2 meters in the next 100 years?
Yeah, we live in that world too in the Netherlands. But even in the high estimate that the professor just gave, I think we're still safe. Our dikes and flood defense system as a whole has been built in various areas to a various different risk level, I should say. We accept in the most populated part where all the economic activity is, we accept a flooding once in every 10,000 years. That's what the dikes were built for. So even if the sea level appears to be 2 meters instead of 1, that would bring the level down to once every 5,000 years, and we think that's still manageable. So to give you more an idea, the lowest level that we accept in the Netherlands, so these are regions which are flood prone but are not so densely populated, do not have a lot of economic activity, and where floods are not expected to have high damage, we accept a level of flooding once every 1,250 years. So. Right. So even with a more rapid increase of sea levels, that would bring these risk levels down.
And I suppose the thinking is once we've managed the first meter, we're thinking about it and we're smarter about it and we're putting the engineering to bear.
Well, I think the Netherlands illustrates that, you know, to stay there under those kinds of rises, you're going to be depending on engineering, or you're thinking about some kind of either ungraceful or graceful retreat. You know, you can, again, retreat can mean lots of different things.
Right.
But hopefully it would be a graceful retreat.
Got it. Admiral, America votes a month from tomorrow, so for the next month at least, we've got allies. And I saw on your map you had shipping lanes.
Be in trouble?
No, I'm not. No. What I am talking about is that you showed shipping lanes, and shipping lanes is about commerce and it's about safety in the world. So you have interests, I assume, that go beyond U.S. naval installations. Do we have to think about whether our allies think about this all that seriously?
Can't get past the 70 meters.
Yeah, I'm having some trouble with that too.
I mean, should we start planning our next submarine base in Colorado?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the world, global responsibilities. I tried to illustrate 100 plus locations where Navy and Marine Corps operate, and the other DoD services are out there as well. We're out there to maintain the peace, maintain the free flow of commerce, safety, security, deterrence, respond to humanitarian crises and disaster relief. And we do more than that than any of us probably care to have to do, right? Whether it's Tokyo or northern Japan, tsunami, Philippine typhoons, Indonesia, earthquake, it goes on and on, the response that you expect your military to undertake. But you got to be out there to do that. You got to be forward deployed. You can't do it from Norfolk and San Diego because then you're not relevant to getting to the need. And that's one of the great benefits of the Navy is that we are forward deployed out there every day. Sailors and Marines ready to perform those missions. But it takes bases to do that, and it takes allies and partners, because no one nation can do that alone. It really takes a network of like-minded navies and nations that are performing this mission together. And so the conversation about our CONUS bases and sea level rise, I think is a very similar conversation at our overseas bases as well, where we we work together with partners and allies to do this kind of work. And we might...
Do you have counterparts in other countries that are having a robust discussion about this?
Discussions, but I'm not aware that the discussions are as robust. I'm just personally not aware. That's a good question. Last night's lecture, I learned about the sea level rise in Japan, for example, and the land subsidence, and it caused me to take a note about what kind of conversations are we having with our Japanese Ministry of Defense counterparts and elsewhere around the world. So I think it's the same coordination outside the fence line in U.S. installations. We have to have that overseas. But you can think also that we might find ourselves responding to more crises in the future.
Yeah.
Because of increased flooding and the effects that has on populations and migrations and humanitarian crisis. And so all the more important to have bases that are resilient and ready to not only survive for their own sake, but then to launch response from those locations.
Professor Nichols, I wanted to just for a moment divert our attention. We've started talking about the rest of the world to the rest of the world. We have places in the United States that if, never mind, let's just get that 77 meters out of our heads for a few minutes, because at that point we don't need to have the discussion. But at a nominal rise in sea level that we anticipate, we have places in the United States that are in danger of not existing, and you're talking about an organized retreat. There are places in the world where in a country there wouldn't be able to be an organized retreat. They'd have to leave the country. How real are these threats? I've heard about the Maldives talking about it a fair amount. How significant is that? What parts of the world are really, really at danger, both because it's happening and because maybe they lack the preparedness?
Well, I mean, I think there's two kind of classes of places that are particularly vulnerable, and you've touched on small islands, and the Maldives is the lowest country on Earth, and they're essentially coral atolls. They're wave-formed islands. I mean, sort of coral rubble's washed up by waves, and people live in quite vulnerable locations even today. So a small change in sea level, the islands might persist, but I don't think I would want to live on an island that was responding to waves breaking over. It's a rather hazardous place to live. So those places being shall we say, forced abandonment is a kind of very real possibility. The other place that is particularly vulnerable are deltas. So like Bangladesh springs to mind, although you have deltas we've mentioned, well, certainly the Mississippi Delta, and there are other deltas in the US, so you have places like this in your own country. But deltas have small islands. We're talking about sort of a few million people. With the deltas of the world, the population is 500 million people. Not all of them are threatened by sea level rise, but I mean, we're talking about very large populations living very close to sea levels, and the question is, what engineering could be done to help them to live there? With small islands, we could think about island building, a bit like the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea. That kind of technology, that's the way they're going to stay there, I think, in the long run. And then in deltas, where we have the example of the Netherlands, and in the case of Bangladesh, and other deltas, lots of sediment comes down the river, and we've traditionally treated it like a pollutant. We've almost kind of got it. We put up dikes and we washed it out to the sea. Can you use that sediment to build land and build elevation? So there are some actually interesting and innovative ideas there, but they're still to be developed.
Very good. Okay. I think it's time to open it up to the mics. I'd like to invite you to go to, there's a mic over there and a mic over there. And I see a lot of people going to that mic, so if you feel like spreading it out, go ahead. I'll start with that. If you'd like, it would be good if you identified your name, who you're with, and your section. And if you have somebody specific you'd like to answer the question, otherwise I'll direct it to whomever the most obvious recipient is. Gentleman over there.
Dave DeZombach. I'm with the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. A quick comment and a question on a topic I don't think has been addressed yet. First, Ali, you asked who's going to lead the discussion. And my comment is engineers need to be prepared to step up and lead a discussion. As a number of panelists mentioned, emphasize that these issues are community-specific, region-specific, and it's not going to be the federal government coming in to provide advice for most communities. For engineers to be prepared to lead, education of engineers needs to be changed in some ways to be able to deal with the uncertainty, to learn about adaptive management, and not just be waited to be tasked in response to a disaster. We're starting that at Carnegie Mellon.
It's a great comment.
My question is about a non-structural option, and that is insurance. I'd ask any of the panelists to comment on the state of insurance. There's a national flood insurance program, what private insurers are doing, what kind of incentives, what kind of perverse incentives that creates in some cases, and I welcome the panel's comments.
That's a very good question. I had that in my mind to know what the insurers bring to bear, whether they simply make a lot of money off of this or whether they would like a lot of flood mitigation. Does anybody have a sense of that?
Well, I could speak to it's interesting, in the UK, what's happened is, as people of insurance companies better understand flooding, they're actually now basically identifying those people they don't want to insure because they have lots of claims. So the government has actually gone into a pact with the insurance industry where they've actually got a solidarity mechanism. We're all paying a little bit more insurance premium so that these people will receive insurance for a certain period of time. It's not a long-term solution. It's buying time for a problem. The insurance industry in Britain also lobbies government to have better flood defences. So it actually is an advocate for, around places like London, around the big risks, it really wants better flood defences.
In my coverage of hurricanes and floods, which I do a lot of, I know that there have been some developments in code requirements in places that are susceptible, but that doesn't help the vast majority of people whose homes weren't built to code or whose businesses weren't. Sir.
Thank you. I'm Wayne Clough. I was formerly president of Georgia Tech and most recently secretary of the Smithsonian here in Washington. Quick comment first, relative to the first speaker. I think it's very important that everybody in this audience needs to own this problem. We've let our scientific brethren carry the brunt of this argument, and engineers have stood back while they've carried the argument. We need to carry the argument. Today it's our problem.
Well said.
We need to be there. We need to be part of it. Secondly, I want to compliment the speakers for a great job in setting a stage for the problem that we face. National academies have a terrific program. Dan Moat and the staff here have taken the Grand Challenges effort to a new level, particularly with the Grand Challenges Scholars Program. And not to take any problems with our audience here, but I don't believe anybody in this audience is under 25. And yet, it's those folks are the ones that are going to carry the brunt of the effects of our lack of action. The Grand Challenges Scholars Program is to try to get young people to educate them or be educated in a way so they understand these problems and can do something about them. And so this would be a great component of the Grand Challenge Scholars Program. It really leads to my question. I'm teaching now back at Georgia Tech, and I find that every class I teach in, students want to do something about this. You don't have to debate with them whether or not this is occurring, all that kind of junk. Our generation may be worthless in that regard, but their generation is ready to do something about it, and we have to help them get ready. I think the Grand Challenges Scholars effort is a tremendous opportunity to factor that in to a nationwide program. Actually, it's a global program because it involves China, UK, and others as well. So my question to the panel would be, what do you think we can do to help young people get ready to really solve this problem?
Right, because that's a great question, great preamble. I mentioned earlier to Bart that Europeans sort of look at this a little bit differently. Our young people are a little bit like Europeans. We look at the climate and the environment and water. You don't have the same battles at that point. But what are the kinds of things any of you think we should be doing to take advantage of the fact that we have, I don't know, a quarter or more of the population that doesn't have to be convinced it's a problem. They just need to be set to the solutions.
Well, to be honest with you, we had a problem too in getting our youngsters to technical universities where they would study hydraulic engineering. But that actually is changing over the last 5 to 10 years, I would say. But back in the 70s, 80s, it wasn't popular at all to do technical study. But as I said, that is changing, and we've had some campaigns actually to attract youngsters to technical universities again. And you can actually, as a government or even as educational community, you can have promotional campaigns to achieve that.
Very good.
And we've been successful in that in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say, I direct 2 coastal engineering master's degrees at the University of Southampton, and I suppose again, students come to us wanting often to learn about climate change. That's one of the things that motivates them, and rather than giving them courses on climate change, we embed it into the whole program. So it's something we touch everywhere where it's relevant. So I think that embedding it within the course is really kind of key to making it to addressing their interest and making it practical and useful in their career.
Very good. Sir.
I'm Stuart Cooper from Ohio State University and in Section 2 Bioengineering, but my question is a narrow one and it's directed toward civil engineers or civil engineering, and that is, in hard port facilities, is it possible to think of either a new construction or retrofitting, whether some of our facilities could be made to float? And therefore accommodate changes in sea level with minimal consequences?
It's a great question. Admiral? Can you make a floating port?
I can imagine it. I don't know how far off the capability would be, but you know, we have dry docks, we have floating dry docks. Right, we have logistics platforms. We have floating logistics platforms. I suppose the concept could be extended even further. Might be an area that requires further study.
Bart?
Thank you.
I'm not sure whether I mentioned that, but in the Netherlands actually we are experimenting with floating residential areas, not just the boats that you see in the canals of Amsterdam, no, but real concrete houses that are floating and going up and down with the tide. There are experiments with floating greenhouses, so that is something definitely worth exploring further.
How big a residential area would you be talking?
It's about 150 houses in an area of Amsterdam, and then in Rotterdam it's about the same. And along rivers you have small scale projects.
It'd be interesting if you just do it per house, and then you can change your neighbors every now and then.
That's right. Yes. Yeah, you could just embark on a journey through the country.
That's right. Just leave for a few months.
If I could add something to that, I think the point is, it may sound far-fetched to somebody, but if you aim for that goal and you start to examine it, you might find a solution that's actually workable at different kinds of locations. So I think it's a great idea, and education institutions are the places to talk about these things.
Yeah. Another example, as I think about it, fuel. I mean, most of our fuel storage is onshore. There are people talking about fuel storage in the ocean, you know, conceptually.
Yeah.
Right? Bladder-type storage systems or something of that nature. So I think it's possible.
Good questions. Sir.
Beauty Mazumdar from University of Michigan. I'm Section 10. Thanks to the panel for educating me about adaptation to sea level rise. My question is prevention. How can you prevent that? And specifically, this question is coming from some of the data I saw from Professor Nichols' presentation. One of the blip in his graph yesterday was Thailand is sinking because they're drawing groundwater too rapidly. Texas, in some places, are losing 1 feet of groundwater every year. And what I learned from Professor Nichols is Houston is already sinking. So how can we prevent, at least to slow down the sea level rise? That is my question.
Yeah, a couple of you touched on sinking and drawing groundwater. Any ideas on this?
Well, I think, if you look around the issue of managing substance, I think in the Netherlands was mentioned already that they put a lot of effort in the Netherlands to try and to control water levels so that they minimize subsidence. But in many of these developing country cities, really the key point is either to provide water by pipe so people don't draw out groundwater, or you go much deeper. But that costs more money, and so do you have a governance framework where those rules will be followed? In Tokyo, Shanghai, etc., it's been very successful. In Jakarta, my understanding is that they've tried and it hasn't worked. So there's governance challenges. But it's work. If you can stop it, that's obviously a source control is always, I think, probably the best approach if it's possible.
Sir.
Alfred Spector, Computer Science, 2 Sigma. So clearly when we think about climate change, that's a long-term strategic problem that requires reengineering the energy economy and decades of convincing and work, et cetera. In what we've been listening to today, some of the things seem to me to be very tactical responses that we want to do. In New York, we raised the level of subway entrances. The one I go to every day, just over a period of a month, was raised a couple feet. Probably will solve a lot of problems with water getting into the subways. I think Kathleen mentioned some of these things you want to do as late as possible because of the net present value cost of money. You want to adapt late. So it's not bad to adapt late in those. There are others that are strategic. So one that was mentioned in your discussion just after the break is if there are 500 million people that are going to be dislocated, that's a strategic issue that requires a lot of thought now because it's highly destabilizing as well as a catastrophe. I think the question that was brought up by the professor from Carnegie Mellon about land use policy, but more importantly, insurance. If we're providing all these motivations for people to build on the shore because of the relatively easy accessibility of insurance or rebuild in floodplains, that's a very long-term strategic problem because it's very difficult to relocate people. There is a question. So the question is, what are the other really big strategic things we need to think about over the long term, not just how do we build new walls or when do we start to build them and the like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I haven't done my job in sort of delineating that. We've sort of mushed it all into one. There are strategic discussions here and there are tactical discussions, but really crucial that we separate them out. You've said a few times, Professor Nichols, that the strategic work, you said it in your own way, but the strategic work will have a better return if we were to actually do that. So I wouldn't mind going through the panel and sort of getting a sense of what you all think need to be done strategically versus tactically. I'll start with you, Admiral, because you have to think about this in terms of the other priorities of the Navy. So some things have to be done because they have to be done now, but some things can be more strategically done.
Yeah, I think in the horizon that I've thought about, the strategic action for me is the regional response, not just the installation response that I've already referenced. There are numerous examples where the base is already engaged with the local population, joint land use studies, this sort of thing. I think that just needs to be enhanced to a much, much greater level so that we get all echelons of government in a location and all disciplines working together. There are other examples. There's a body in the Norfolk area working now that is military, local communities, multidisciplinary, doing just what I mentioned, trying to solve the bigger strategic issues, to get their arms around the strategic issues to begin with. So that's the direction I think we have to head.
Anybody else want to comment on that, Bart?
Yeah.
You've obviously had to think about this a lot.
Sorry?
You've obviously had to think about the strategic versus
well,
the tactical.
Yeah, but at the moment, I think what we are looking at, and I think I pointed it out, is raising awareness, and that sort of ties into what the Admiral was just saying. That at a local level, you need to have awareness of what the threats are, and that how we need to respond to that. It's not just a flood control policy. It's not just something that is 100% governed by the central government. And if it were, you would also need support on the individual level. So raising awareness is something that we're really working hard on at the moment.
If I could kind of talk about that a little bit. So the way we look at it, adaptation to changing sea levels, is really a continuum between the tactical and the strategic. And one way to think about that is the elevations that you're getting at, and that's really related to the total water levels. And I think Robert said it earlier, it's mean sea level, it's the tide, it's the surge, it's the waves. So if you take Miami and you think about a meter rise in Miami, if all you cared about was mean sea level, maybe 2090. But if you care about the tidal effects, you might be looking at 2070. Then if you look at, say, a 10% flood, you might be looking at 2050. But if you're looking at a 1% or larger event, it's today. It's already exceeded. So the idea is that when we think about these, it depends on your perspective. What kind of event is the disruption that causes you to want to adapt? And I think we've really spent a lot of time trying to get people to understand what's the time window, and how much more cost effective it is to prepare than it is to respond, up to 9 or 10 times more effective.
Right. David, this is an interesting question for you. It's one we talk about, that you outlined a prescriptive that sounded like you wanted to take a strategic approach to this thing. Obviously, you're spurred on by things that make you have to raise the subway entrances and things like that.
Right.
Although you guys don't do the subways, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we have to raise our equipment as well. So, we think about it as there's the engineering responses that we're going to have to do. And then we think about it as, okay, is it going to be 10 meters or is it going to be 15 or 20 meters, right? And there are things that we can do to make it closer to 10 than to 20 or 30. And these are things that we're trying to do in our industry, right? Trying to promote technologies that are less greenhouse gas emissive, trying to promote different building technologies that use less electricity, which if you think about strategic, right? Those are the things which you spread across multiple industries, which we do year after year, decade after decade, which would, blunt the curve, right? So we don't just say, well, it'll be what it'll be, and let's just get a forecast and just go start building, right? I don't think that's a prudent way for us to approach it. We'll do what we must, but then we also do the things that we can to reduce just how much of the work we're going to have to do in this area.
And Robert, your presentation is very big, but I think if I were to characterize you, I'd say that you fall very heavily on the side of looking at this strategically.
Absolutely, and I'd say, I think really to respond strategically, you have to do the analysis so you understand what the strategic issues are, because otherwise you are probably locked into the tactical. So I think you have to tease out what are the, you mentioned sort of land use planning, and it's striking in the UK. Historically, we built a lot of property, including very recently, in areas that are well below normal high tides. Not areas that are flooded in extreme events. They would be flooded every day if you didn't have flood defenses. And now we're having to upgrade those defenses. So in hindsight, probably not a very wise land use decision. And I think also but that has to be linked to education and the public and governance, because this information is useless unless there's a client for it that's willing to make those strategic decisions.
Yeah, very good question. Thank you, sir.
Shelley Weinbaum, City College of New York, Bioengineering Section 2. This question is really addressed to comments made by Kate and also David, and it regards the human element. What will people do because of this? I live in One Brooklyn Bridge Park, right on the Brooklyn waterfront, and I have a total experience of being flooded during Sandy, and I think this is the essence of what I want to tell you. How do people react? The building that I live in, 12 stories tall, very big building, had 1,500 people living in it. We were told to evacuate. You probably couldn't guess how many people decided to stay and fill their bathtubs with water so they could flush their toilets. I was one of the people 700 who stayed. And of course it became very gruesome, because the generators were knocked out, the elevators were knocked out. To go down and had to carry up gallon quarts of fresh water to drink, 160 stairs each way. So this was really a hard experience, and we had no electricity for 3 weeks. Okay, so this addresses what David was telling you earlier. Now, the more important thing here is that this city, it's not about voting. The city is controlled by real estate interests. In Brooklyn Bridge Park right now, they are talking about putting up a luxury 320-foot tower for $500 million on a plot that was totally covered by water, where the groundwater level is within 5 feet of the surface.
Are you going to announce your candidacy? Because I think this is where this is going.
Yeah. Well, the point here is that why does this happen? The Brooklyn Bridge Park Corporation, which had a board of 14 people, all 4 elected officials voted against the building of such a structure. All the real estate and lawyer people, all 10 of them, voted for it. This construction is going to start in 2017, and I think many of you have read about the Millennium Tower disaster.
Okay, I got to get a question in here somewhere.
So the question is, really, how do you get people to think and be effective? And you were, both of Kate started to talk about this. Memories are very short.
All right, good question. So here's the issue. I don't know enough about this to know whether the building of big buildings or the density is the issue. We do have some relation between very densely populated places and places that flood, but that may or may not. Kate said people settle by the water for lots of reasons historically. What do we need to think about when building for property developers? Should they not be developing in places that are on floodplains? That's a bit of a problem in Brooklyn.
Exactly the
question. Right, except I would say that horse has left the barn in Brooklyn. So what do we do? It's a good question. What do we do? We are building in London, we're building in New York, we're building in all sorts of places.
So I don't think we can stop developers building in areas that are close to water, even if it's prone to flooding. If you look at Brooklyn, for example, and all the stoops that they have, historians tell me that was because historically there would be regular flooding, and it was to prevent the water from getting into the house itself. So you had the stoop. New buildings, if you build it appropriately. So, for example, Con Edison, if you're putting in transformers in your building, we require it has to be on the 2nd floor or higher, right? So we've done stuff on our side, right? And as the Admiral said, if the utility makes their adjustments and then the customer on their end makes their adjustments, then you're okay. So if the new buildings build and put their equipment above the flood level, then you're going to be in lights and you're going to be able to have water after an event. If they do other,
I'm talking about the engineering problem of buildings sinking and leaning.
Well,
but I'm talking about.
I'm not a civil engineer, but all of our infrastructure in Manhattan, we put it on piles. It's been on piles for 100+ years. So I think there are ways that you can build to withstand, more sea level rise without saying you absolutely can't do it. I think it can be done safely. It's just a matter of, how much of it is prudent to be done, and that's a decision made by the investors who build these structures.
Bart or Kate, did you have something?
Yeah, I want to point out when you were asking the question that what occurred to me was that there's an example of a financial return on the investment, which has a much shorter time period than a public infrastructure, which is a very long time period. So it's the difference between financial and political solutions and engineering and economic solutions. So part of what our job is to do is to make sure that those engineering and economic solutions are the ones that get a little bit more attention That's
Yeah,
all
and
I'm
you brought this up earlier, and this is a major point. This gentleman's question was as much economic as it is engineering. And there is a level of public education that has to take place. I certainly, as a property owner, when I undergo renovations and I have to meet a whole lot of codes, it seems frustrating and expensive to me because I don't know the history of why all of those things are put into place, and if I knew them, they might make more sense to me. Bart, I'd like to hear from you and from Robert on this.
Well, I would like to say that the question is actually, it's not impossible. I mean, if we would not be able to build in areas that are flood prone, we could stop constructing now. Because, as I said, all the big cities are under sea level. So the problem is you shouldn't actually look at it in isolation. If you have a project like that, the flood control should be in place. We have the flood control in place in these cities, and that's why we keep on developing. But most of it is below sea level. And if the flood control wasn't working, if the flood defenses wouldn't work, if the pumps, the drainage wouldn't work, it's drained constantly, 24 hours a day, then this would all be flooded. So it is possible, but you should have the flood defenses and the drainage in place.
Robert? I was just going to say, if it was in the UK, I mean, it's a very large investment, lots of money going into it, it would be allowed, but we define a flood level, normally the 100-year flood level, and an allowance for sea level rise, and so it would be expected to be, the base level would be above that level, allowing for 50 to 100 years of sea level rise. So that's one solution, and with such an expensive building, I'd have thought the costs would be rather, the developer would not flinch at those costs.
Fine. All right, very good question. Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name is Tony Dalrymple, Civil Engineering at Johns Hopkins University and Section 4. My question is to Dr. White, and it's going back to the strategic part of the discussion. And in the U.S., as has been pointed out, we have a number of coastal cities, and some of them just recently escaped from a major disaster. And the Corps of Engineers historically has been reactive, so we've had $14 billion of coastal protection for New Orleans area post-Katrina, whereas had we spent a lot of money, much less money ahead of time, that wouldn't have happened. We have Sandy with reactive response. And you pointed out that the Corps of Engineers is project-driven, and these projects have to go through Congress, and they're pretty long-term. So the question is, how do we do strategic thinking within the Corps, which bills itself as the nation's coastal engineer? So the expertise lies with the Corps. They need to tell the politicians what the problems are. And 2 years ago, the NRC had a study that pointed out, and it was funded by the Corps, pointed out that the Corps should probably be more proactive in going to major cities like Miami and say, you have a problem, it's getting worse, and they're starting to realize this, but start thinking strategically with large-scale, either regional or system-wide kinds of approaches to the problem rather than project by project. So my question is, what's going on strategically within the Corps to address these major coastal cities and their problems?
Okay, fair criticism of the Corps. I would say that the idea of being proactive has really taken hold, especially since Hurricane Katrina. Looking at the lessons learned from Katrina, the Interagency Performance Evaluation Task Force report, the ASCE report, other analyses external to the Corps, it really looked at the idea that we must be prepared for the foreseeable future conditions. And that's really one of the things that's pushed our climate change program forward, being prepared for these kinds of situations, whether it's drought, intense rainfall, sea level, other types of events. And so we've developed policies and technical guidance that help do that. It's a way of being proactive to say, this is what we will be doing. And then the second thing is to incorporate those new policies and technical guidance into the project planning. So we have quite a bit of external existing infrastructure that we need to take care of, but if we start to incorporate these now into the newer projects, eventually as the existing infrastructure becomes more vulnerable, we'll be using that there. So I'd say to the extent that we can, as a federal agency, which is authorized and appropriated by Congress, we are trying to make that approach more proactive.
I have to say, I always enjoy this event because the panel is always so great and the questions are just terrific. So thank you all for such great questions. Sir.
Hi, I'm Wang Chu from the University of Illinois, Section 7. I think engineers can do great things if we have the right budget. And it's interesting to notice from the Emira that even the Navy has a budget problem and budget woes. Universities have been facing research budget issues in the last 2 decades or so. And if you read the book by, say, Joseph Stiglitz, who is the Nobel Prize-winning economist from Chicago, he attributes much of our budget woes to tax cuts in the wrong place in the last 2 decades. And our government is impoverished because of that. Our infrastructures are crumbling and so on. And so just last night we heard from Donald Trump that if he gets elected, he will have more tax cuts. You know, so it's interesting to notice that. So I'm very interested in the...
Is that the part that stuck out to you of last night?
No. But I'm interested in the concept of PPP, the public-private partnership concept. How many countries have run their country on that concept using PPP? This question is for the Emira.
It's a fantastic question. It's one that's close to my heart because it is one of those things that in America we like to think we do it better than most people, and in many cases that's the case, but these public-private partnerships for large infrastructure things happen better elsewhere in the world. We have a strange relationship in the United States. Either it's a purely private enterprise or it's up to you guys in the military or you at the Corps of Engineers, and we don't really understand how we build these big things together. So I'm open to everybody. When it comes to major infrastructure issues and water and flooding and storms and hurricanes, public-private partnerships seem to be a good idea, but we don't do it all that much in the U.S. I'll start with you, Admiral.
Yeah, my experience with it is just in 2 areas on a military installation. It's in housing. You know, 15 years ago, our military housing was in shambles. It was just too difficult for us to keep it up to the standards that we expect our sailors and Marines and soldiers and airmen to live in. And so the concept of public-private venture, where we, Navy in our case, formed a corporation with an industry partner, and we kicked in the housing we had in the land, and the industry partner went and got private financing, assumed control of the housing, demolished some, renovated some, built new. And they own and operate the housing for 40 or so years. It's been wildly successful. And there is a funding stream that each service member gets that funds that mechanism. Works very well. The second example is with our energy saving performance mechanism or our utility energy savings contracts, where we go to either a utility company or industry, and they come in and they look at all the technological improvements they can make to the base. They make that investment, and then we pay that mortgage back over the term of the contract. Again, there is a funding mechanism out of our utility budgets to pay for that. We get much lower energy usage, but the funding to the base is really the same until the performance period is paid off. My earlier comments about PPV in the area of sea level rise was really exploring the topic of our utility systems on bases that are attached to the utility systems outside the fence line. And investment has to be made on both sides of that fence line. What ideas can we use to make those investments together? The current funding mechanisms for the federal government and industry and municipalities, they're all different. And it seems to me they have to be synchronized somehow for this to work. That's my level of thinking.
Any other takers? It's a good answer, and I think it was more of a statement than anything else. Why don't we do this a little bit better? Most Americans only interact with this sort of model at an airport or on a toll bridge or something like that. But really, when we have to do these expensive things, we might need to think about this a little more carefully. Over there.
Thank you.
Janet Herring, Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, Section 4. I'd actually like to follow up my friend and former fellow student's comment, Dave Dezombach's comment about engineers stepping up to the conversation. We heard yesterday about Worcester Polytech, where I think there's an attempt to educate engineers so that they can really do that, but I have to admit that some engineers are not absolutely fantastic at it these days. And we do have a lot of colleagues in the social sciences who maybe have a better understanding of how people think. We heard that question before, and how they're likely to respond to things and how to communicate to them. And I wonder, especially with the core and our university representative, what are the current activities that try and tap into the skills of social scientists and the humanities and the arts to really bring these messages forward and communicate them in a way that is then accessible to the general public?
That's a tough one.
I think, Rob, I'll go on that one. So I totally agree with you. The approaches have to be interdisciplinary, and that means that the engineers have to make room for the social scientists to come in. The old stereotype of the engineer is dead, right? It's not just, yesterday we couldn't spell engineer, and now we are one. You know, we can't communicate, we can't write. If we have a product and we can't communicate it, whether it's in writing or orally or through graphics, then we don't really have a product. So I think at least in the core and with the private engineers that I work with, the consulting engineering firms, that communication skill is really important. We have understood this, again, the social vulnerability, the increasing use of those social vulnerability indexes, like Susan Cutter's, the BRIC index. Those things really rose after Katrina, when we found that in Katrina it was really the people least able to bear the burden that actually bore the burden the most. And so we've tried to make an effort to bring in the social sciences, and I think we could do a better job at that.
I was going to just, some of the work that we do in the UK, I mean, it's not my personal work, we certainly, I think, recognize the importance of the multidisciplinary approach, as Kate said, and I think also trying to actually engage with the sort of the public, really, because often I think there's a feeling in the UK that the sort of, the Environment Agency lead the coastal initiatives, and they engage with technical people. They come along with their view, and it doesn't necessarily quite land with the local people. They don't, and so we've been setting up approaches where we try and actually capture people's knowledge and understanding about the coast and engage in a dialogue with them a little bit more. And I think that is really the way forward, because otherwise it seems to lead to conflict rather than a more cooperative approach. So I sort of strongly support that, but it's jolly hard and difficult. But it's worth exploring.
Yeah, this has come up enough that I think it's definitely something that Dan and team should think about. It's hard because it's hard for the individual to understand what role they have in this. With climate change, you can bring it to the level of the individual, even though that's not necessarily scientifically the best thing to do, but you can make it a consumer-driven issue. How do you make this a consumer-driven issue? Short of my not building a house that's too low, and most people in America don't build their own houses, what do you do? And it's an interesting point, because really the consumer-driven issue here is, I think, as Kate said, to bring pressure to bear on those who make decisions, whether they're companies or governments. But there's nothing I can do personally about the sea level rise, so it's hard to personalize the movement. But we do have to think about ways to do that. Ma'am.
Well, they asked if there was anyone in their 20s, so I figured that was my cue.
Nice. There's fewer of you than there are Twitter users in the room.
I have a quick comment and also a question. My name is Christina Chang. I'm here celebrating with an inductee, my dad.
Wow.
And also another inductee, a professor of mine from undergrad, who inspired me to dedicate my research career to climate solutions. I'm a PhD student working at Harvard in a materials engineering lab. I guess my comment is, I don't speak for everyone in my generation, and millennials can be hard to understand for sure, but I do think that there are many of us that at least I've seen who are really humbled by the progress that has been made by all of the present and past scientists and engineers, and are really excited to take on this mantle and innovate towards solutions. So I think there's a lot of a hope there. I guess I would also agree with what Dr. Moat was saying yesterday about framing it in the context of the societal good. I think that can definitely help bring students into the fold who might not have realized that engineering could be something for them. I resonate with that. My question is a little bit societal in nature, so we haven't talked a lot about climate justice, but we've talked about some of the locations that are going to be hardest hit. So Kiribati, Bangladesh, Marshall Islands, Philippines, that don't have the technological resources that we do have here to adapt. And I'm just wondering, whose responsibility will it be to help those nations and those populations, both in terms of leadership and in terms of footing the bill?
Great question. Thank you so much. And thank you for what you do, and thanks for joining the chorus here and putting your voice into it. So we're not all thinking that there aren't kids involved. All right, it sort of goes to an earlier discussion we had about who's in charge, but it's framed a little differently. It's for those who don't have the resources. And we all seem to know that I think everybody has said this, that if you have the resources, we have the solutions. What if you don't have the resources and you're really in danger of disappearing?
Well, I suppose it's a very good question. And I think, though, to me, it touches on the relationship of adaptation and development, because the places you've mentioned are places that desperately need development. So I'm working in Bangladesh, I'm working in the Maldives, working in several deltas. And I think there we try and take the philosophy of, exactly that philosophy of thinking about what climate change means in the context of today's situation and where they would like to be in the next few decades and where it's plausible for them to go. So to join together the adaptation and development agendas so that we can build a more viable economy, more resources to adapt, etc. So I sort of see that as a process, and in a way I think you can see adaptation maybe as being an important component of development, which is obviously a bigger agenda. That's how I'd see it.
Kate?
If I could add a comment to that, Robert and I and a few other colleagues have been working on this issue for a while, because generally people think of the United States as the one that develops solutions and then brings them to the developing world. And in fact, when we looked around the world and when we looked around the U.S., not all of the U.S. has the resources. You know, we have third world pockets in our country, and they need solutions that can be achieved with less resources than somebody like New York City. So we sent some people around the world to look at the kind of solutions that you could bring here to the U.S. And two of the countries we looked at were Bangladesh and Cuba. Bangladesh has really reduced a lot of hurricane-related deaths because of a better connection with preparedness. The neighbors are connected. They know exactly what to do. Nobody gets left behind. You know, simple solutions that we can use here. And then with Cuba, it was really the increase in the forecasting for hurricanes that made quite a difference. But still, it was that connectedness between the people. So there are ideas that we can use here and that can be used successfully in other developing nations.
And I just want to piggyback on what you said. It's really important that, you know, we don't...
David, just speaking to the mic a little bit more.
I'm saying it's really important that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that you always have to deliver the technology to them, right? So what works for Manhattan, for example, necessarily won't work elsewhere. So I'm from Jamaica originally, and I think about the way we build houses in Jamaica, very different from the way you build houses in America. It's primarily cinder block and steel. Right? Why? Because we have hurricanes, a lot of them. Okay? And if a hurricane passes through Jamaica, I don't expect to hear that more than maybe 4 people die from it, right? There's going to be one crazy person who goes for a stroll. There's going to be one person who tries to drive across a river, you know, and some craziness, right? And then someone has a heart attack. But you don't find, you know, 200 people die from a hurricane in Jamaica, because we build for it using an appropriate technology for the country. And then the preparedness response, everyone knows to go to a shelter, et cetera. So I think in many cases it's probably a matter of assisting them to develop their own technology, you know, with people like Dr. Nichols saying, okay, here's some of the engineering methodologies of developing your own solutions. And I think that will be a big part of the answer.
Admiral.
I'm just struck that the concerns that you have and your generation have and are discussing, they're discussed at, to me, all levels Department of Defense and our government's interagency, it seems to me. For example, I don't know that I have solutions for the funding necessarily for some of these developing nations, but we have a structure that has global combatant commanders, geographic combatant commanders, in this case, Pacific Command out of Pearl Harbor, looks after the entire Pacific, and not just from a warfighting perspective, but for a total security envelope perspective, which gets into issues that you're talking about, responding to disasters, responding to all sorts of crises or trouble. And, just responding after a hurricane or typhoon is one thing, but building capacity in these nations for them to help themselves ahead of time is part of the investment that is being made, perhaps not in the right quantity of funding, in my view, but I think it's very successful when the DoD plus our interagency partners go to places like Timor-Leste or Philippines or Cambodia and work military to military, community to community, and help build capacity, whether it's subject matter expertise exchanges where we have engineers go, or we have troops go and they do medical work together or engineering work together. I think it's a very effective approach that brings people together and does build capacity. Perhaps there just should be more attention on that.
Very thoughtful answers. Thank you to all of you, and thank you for the question. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Dave Kriebel. I'm a visitor today from the U.S. Naval Academy, where I'm a professor in ocean engineering. My question is about design based on a cost-benefit analysis versus based on some level of acceptable risk. Mr. de Jong mentioned that in the developed parts of Holland, engineering works are designed for a 1 in 10,000 year event. In the U.S., we really don't have any standard quite like that. We have the FEMA flood insurance standard of a 1 in 100 year event, and some of the codes, ASCE 7 and some of the building codes, are tied to that. But then, as Dr. White mentioned, in the Corps, we do cost-benefit analysis and frequently end up with a design event less than a 1 in 100 year event. And then the problem, of course, with sea level rise is, as Mr. de Jong mentioned, the 1 in 10,000 year event gets driven down, but a 1 in 100 year event, I've looked at this in Annapolis, with modest sea level rise, may be a 5 to 10 year event, in 2100. So my question is there something about our cost-benefit analysis that's giving us a much lower level of acceptable risk than what we should have in our country?
Very interesting. That's a very interesting question. I can barely understand it. But that's why we have 5 excellent panelists.
Oh, we're going to back away a little bit from. Okay, so that's really interesting. We're a federal agency. We abide by federal regulations. We follow the Office of Management and Budget's requirements for federal investments, and that's because they're trying to maximize the return on the investment to the taxpayer. And so the benefit cost analyses that we perform, different agencies perform, maybe have a little bit of different requirements, but essentially for us, if you think about coastal risk reduction, the benefit cost analyses are driven by the damages, and that's why after Sandy, you found that some areas of New Jersey were fairly resilient to damage, and that's because they had beaches, shoreline protection built by the Corps of Engineers that attenuated the wave energy and reduced their damages. And they could afford those because they were very expensive properties, right? The damages were high. And my issue for a number of years has not been protecting the rich people who can afford to build the house anyway. It's the rest of the population that doesn't have those particular damages. And so really, these are not built with except for our Mississippi River and tributaries projects, our projects aren't built with reasonable, as low as reasonable possible risk in mind. Our dam safety program does include the LARP principles, but otherwise it's driven by benefit cost, and that's because that's what people want from their government here. They want us to use their tax dollars responsibly and not overinvest it early. But that is an issue with climate change, as you pointed out.
I was going to make a comment that really, obviously, benefit-cost ratio depends critically on what you can assume as a discount rate. Yeah. So, I mean, so there's a philosophical point here, isn't it? It's how much you value the future. And in Britain, we use cost-benefit analysis as well. But I mean, I think it's quite a big philosophical question, isn't it, really? Because some people argue the discount rates are far too high, which would mean that we would have very different decisions. So that's maybe something to debate almost in the political arena, maybe.
For us, we use OMB specifies a discount rate. We must use that discount rate, but it doesn't prevent us from conducting sensitivity analyses to the discount rate. And the idea being that if we look at a very low discount rate, we are able to justify adaptation measures that bring us past the 50-year economic analysis period that OMB requires. Now, as engineers, our horizon is 100 years. So we have a struggle for adaptation between 50 years and 100 years. That's where our big problem is. Before 50 years, we can usually come up with a justification.
And as a private company, we also do benefit cost justifications, right? So there's some assets that we're going to harden, some we're going to raise, and some we put them in a state where it'll be relatively easy to de-energize, ride out the flood, and then come back after, right? So if we were to harden those and make them totally submersible, it would be just an absolutely huge bill, right? Versus the area is going to be evacuated anyway, right? So before the flood comes in, there's going to be an evacuation order. There's going to be a few people hanging around, and we'll be able to get it back in 2 days, right? So if you can ride through that event and save yourself, $200 million, then it's not hard to get the stakeholders to buy into it. So that's for us, where it's a limited area, we're going to do that. Now, if you're talking about a big area, right, you're talking about the half of the Netherlands, then I'm sure the benefits cost numbers very quickly swing the other way where you can much more easily justify multi-billion-dollar breakwaters and dams, etc.
Thank you for those excellent answers. I'm afraid we are out of time. It has been a terrific, terrific session, and I really want to thank you all for your participation. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody. I want to bring Dan Mote up here to close up the session and say thank you to our fantastic panel and to all of you. Thank you.
Great job.
Really great panel.
Absolutely great job. This has been an absolutely great panel, really. Thank you all very much. And I even thank Ollie Velci very much. I even thank him. No, he is a great moderator. As you can see why he's a favorite of at least my favorite of the Academy. He gets to it very well. Thank you, Ollie. And thank you all very much. I really appreciate I appreciate not only your confidence in what you do, but I appreciate very much the effort you put in to prepare for this panel. It's the best prepared panel we've had here, and you represented your different sectors very well, so that all of us here got a better idea of what you're doing in different domains. And so the dimension of the discussion was like one I've never heard before. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.